Hello, my name is Karen. I am a friend of Sydney's, and I'm going to be talking tonight. My family has been at Vista for a few years now. I am a professional artist on the side. Mostly, I'm a stay-at-home mom, and recently I've been a student also. I went back to school 2 years ago into seminary and have been there for the last 2 years. My emphasis is on women in theology, which basically is a fancy way to say that I've been studying women in the scriptures, women in the early church, and a lot of theology concerning women. It's been a really long, hard road to get to seminary when you're in your 40s, but here I am. It's been a fun ride. I'm going to start tonight with a little bit about my story first. I did not grow up in a Christian home. My parents were both alcoholics. I didn't really know any different at the time, didn't know how different that was than other families in my neighborhood. But some neighborhood kids invited me and my brother to a vacation Bible school when I was about 5, and it happened to be right at the entrance to our neighborhood where the church was, where this VBS was. And so my brother and I rode our bikes to this VBS, and we loved it. Somewhere along the way, we just kept going. And for quite a few years, the two of us rode our bikes to church every Sunday morning. We would get our little selves dressed and go to church alone. And I'm told they knew if we were there because our bikes were heaped up by the front of the church building. And so they knew if the two of us were there that Sunday morning. And I spent those Sunday mornings in Sunday school learning from a lot of older women about Jesus, his disciples, and some old guys in the Bible. But to be honest, I really didn't get the whole picture of the story of God and what God was saying in Scripture yet. But I knew that church felt safe. And I knew when I walked in the doors that someone there loved me. And that made a big difference. So after 5 to 7 years of the two of us going alone, my parents started to join us, and they radically changed their lives and finally met Jesus after my brother and I sharing with them what we had learned for years on Sundays. And in rapid fire succession, in one summer, all of us got baptized several weeks apart, and collectively our family found Jesus, but also individually too. I felt I knew Jesus deeply by this time, and I was really indebted to him for changing my life, but also literally watching him radically change my parents' lives. And I was about 12, and it was at that time that my life was about to drastically change again. Just 2 months after the baptisms, my dad was on his way home from work and had a massive heart attack and passed away instantly. We just simply never saw him again, and as you can imagine, it was very traumatic. I, at 12, didn't really know what to do, but I poured my life into church because that was all that I knew at that time. Quietly wrestled with God, asked him questions. Did he even care? Did he even know what it was like to go through something like this? And a few years go by, and my brother went off to college, and I found myself living as a teenager with my mom, who in hindsight was pretty severely depressed. I couldn't have named it that then, but I just knew that I didn't really want to be at home with her. So I did anything. If the church was open, I was there, mostly, to be honest, just to not have to be at home. And it was in the middle of this darkness that my mom also got sick. She went into the hospital on a Thursday with what became known as a blood disorder, and they ran test after test. And then it became apparent that her cancer had returned that she had had many years before. And that cancer, working with the blood disorder, took her at a very rapid pace, and she died 5 days after she went into the hospital. So here I was, 16 years old, and utterly alone. The church did step up, and they helped me with a lot of things, like filing life insurance and selling a car, having an estate sale, and honestly doing all the crappy things that you have to do when somebody dies. And my youth pastor and his wife let me come over and cry and ask really hard questions about suffering and theology and why God lets bad things happen. I kept growing in my relationship with God, and I can tell you the night that I felt called to ministry, where I was, and how but also at the same time, I kept running into places that I wasn't allowed to serve in church. Young life at that time became a big outlet for me, and I found myself as a senior in high school being able to lead club and Bible studies for other high schoolers. And I was incredibly grateful to have a place to serve, but it also grieved me that it couldn't be in this church that I loved. I poured my heart into Jesus, and I really didn't feel like I had anywhere else to go. And by the time I got to college, I found myself in a small Christian school, much like UMHB, majoring in biblical text and taking Greek and ministry classes and learning how to pastor. But sadly, as both a female and a young college student, I didn't feel like I had much to offer the church. I could serve them in the nursery and by then the youth group, but that was about it. I didn't feel like I had much else to offer. There were gendered and generational lines that I didn't feel like I could overstep, and that kept me from speaking up on a perspective of suffering that I think in hindsight I could have offered some wisdom to the church. So one summer of college, I did have an internship, and I was able to work at an inner city church in Houston. And it was a place that I finally felt I could connect with some people. They were suffering in many tragically different ways than I had, but I felt like we all had a common ground in suffering, and we all knew what it was like to hurt. And I knew what it was like to feel like grief might swallow you up. But I also knew that God would never let me go, and He gave me a voice in that church to be able to say that to my friends there. I did see people who I knew, adults at that time in my life, lose loved ones, and I watched in horror as sometimes other adults said awful things like everything happens for a reason, or God just needed them more, or the worst one, God doesn't give anyone more than they can handle. That wasn't jiving with the Bible that I was reading. So many of the people in the Bible seemed to have a lot more than they could handle. And I think that was kind of the point, that we need God when we're going through things like that. And as I watched this, I desperately wanted to speak up, but I didn't really believe that I had much to offer beyond rocking babies in the nursery. What did I know after all? I was just a college kid. If I could sit over coffee with my college self, I would lift her head up though, and I would tell her that she does in fact know quite a bit. She has a voice that the church needs to hear from. She has a life experience that is unique to her, and that is how we grow as a church, by listening empathetically to our brothers and sisters. One way I have learned in seminary so much is from my African American siblings. They have taught me a different perspective of the text. One that is specifically meaningful has been how they see slaves in America, how they saw Jesus, and Jesus was offering them physical and spiritual freedom. They saw the bigger picture of Exodus and what God was telling and how that applied to them as well. And I've learned about the redemption that they found in Jesus' suffering. They have showed me that Jesus can understand the pain that we're going through right now. The tragedy, the grief, the gut-wrenching pain, Jesus knows what it's like. And Hebrews tells us that we have a great high priest who knows what it's like. And that same high priest offers us hope. For the slaves in America, that meant hope and liberation, both as a tangible reality for them, but also liberating them from the sin of slavery, and one that frees us from sin in general as well. Their voices in my life have given me hope in that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer with us. And they've taught me a lot about Jesus through their suffering, and I need their voice in my life. Knowing that Jesus knows what it's like to suffer has been a source of great comfort to me, and it's also been one I believe that He's asked me to use in my life. I really don't have all the answers for why God allows suffering or for the problem of pain, but I do know that we have a God that suffers them with us. Sometimes He asks us to use what we've gone through to grow empathy for our fellow brother and sister. One of my favorite quotes from Diane Langberg says, in recent years, I've begun to understand that the call of God on my life is a bit unusual. It's a clear call to enter into the fellowship of His sufferings. It's a call to weep with those who weep, and we must not forget that we serve a God who weeps, for He would never call us to something that we do not first find in Him. Suffering is a really great teacher on the heart of Jesus. It doesn't care how old you are, what gender you are, what your socioeconomic status is. It can teach us all about the heart of Jesus if we will listen. Some of you have been through hard things, through your parents divorcing, or maybe you've lost loved ones, or maybe you know what it's like to be addicted to drugs or pornography or alcohol, and maybe you've come out the other side. The church needs you. We need to hear your voice in that. We need to hear the hope and peace that you have in Jesus. And your experience in life, no matter how big or small, has given you an empathy and a lesson in how to pastor. Henry Nouwen, one of my favorite authors, said this: "When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice or solutions or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. It's the friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, and who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares." So I would venture that most of you have been through something in your life that has grown you, not only maybe in your personal walk, but into a friend also that can be with people who are suffering. Now, I've shared a lot of deeply personal things about my story, and we're going to get to some questions in a minute, but if you're not at a place to share anything like that, truly, it is totally okay. I give you permission to have a pass and not answer any questions. I've had plenty of times in my life where I've been in a situation like that, and I just didn't want to share and wasn't ready to. And some of you, as you raised your hands earlier, are freshmen, and tonight might be your first night at Vista, and you might not feel comfortable either, and that is totally okay. So we have two different questions for your table. The first one is, if you're comfortable sharing, what part of your story do you think has taught you the most about Jesus? And the second one is there someone that comes to your mind when you think of a friend like Henry Nouwen described? Somebody who's been there for you, somebody who just could sit and listen, and what did you learn from them? What was that like? So we'll give you all 5 or 10 minutes to discuss that at your tables. Okay, we're gonna come back together. Okay, so next we're gonna talk a little bit about your generation, Gen Z, and Paul and Timothy. Gen Z is totally my favorite generation. I love you guys. So I'm gonna try to keep it cool. Okay, so a recent Pew research showed that Gen Z is the most radically and ethically diverse generation yet. You have grown up seeing diversity in a far better way than I did, and especially my parents did. And you see the need for diversity in our churches. We need you, and we need that voice. So I was listening this summer to one of my favorite podcasts called Voxology, and in it, they were interviewing a girl named Caitlin Chess. She is a young Gen Z. She's at Duke right now, getting her PhD in politics and theology. But in this episode, they were talking about the younger generation and church, and it was a really great episode. And one of the guys in this podcast is a teacher, and he was talking about his class. He was having a conversation with them one day, and he was specifically talking about this Gen Z, but he said this. He said, "Who has moved the needle on the conversation about the environment in the last 6 years? It's Greta Thunberg. She's 20 now. Who has pushed the envelope the most on women's education recently? That would be Malala, a 25-year-old female from Pakistan. And then you have the Parkland students who debated 2 U.S. senators and the NRA about gun violence after a mass shooting at their school took the lives of 17 people." In short, he was basically saying that some of the most controversial topics on earth right now are being talked about, but they're being changed because of your generation. You have a need for transparency, and frankly, you have a BS meter that I think the church needs today. And so I want to talk a little bit about the younger generation and the relationship between Paul and Timothy. Timothy was kind of like an assistant to Paul. He first comes up in Acts 16. So Paul, he was a missionary. If you don't know about him, he met Jesus later, but basically was a missionary, and he shows up a lot in Acts, wrote a lot of the New Testament, but he took 3 different missionary trips. You can read about those in Acts. And in Acts 16, he's on his second missionary journey. On his first journey, he went to a place called Asia Minor, which is basically modern-day Turkey, and he goes back to those churches on a second trip, and it's here that he meets Timothy. In his second letter to Timothy, so he wrote 2 letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, to him, we find out that Timothy's grandmother, Lois, and his mother, Eunice, were some of Paul's first converts in Lystra. Paul commends these women's faith, and in Acts tells us also that Eunice was a Jew and that her husband, who isn't named, was a Greek. We don't know anything about her husband, which would be Timothy's dad. He's just not mentioned in Scripture. Some scholars think that Timothy's dad died, and that's why he's not mentioned. And also, Paul says that he considers him like a son, and so some scholars think that he probably passed away, and so Paul kind of fathered him as well. We do know that Lois and Eunice taught him from infancy the Scriptures, and he ends up traveling with Paul on Paul's 3rd missionary journey. And he then ends up pastoring in Ephesus. And tradition, it's not in the Bible, but later church tradition tells us that Timothy was the first bishop in Ephesus and likely died there as a martyr. Now, one of the most striking things that Paul says to Timothy is in his first letter, and he says, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, and faith, and in purity. And until I come, devote yourselves to the public reading of Scripture, to preaching, and to teaching. Do not neglect your gift, which was given to you through prophecy when the body of elders laid their hands on you." Timothy was young, and he allowed himself to be taught by Paul. He traveled with him, and he learned from him. He was multi-ethnic. He was likely without a father, and Scripture tells us that he had a sincere faith. He took ownership of that faith that was passed down from his mom and his grandma, and Paul helped give him from that faith, and Paul gave him a theological agency to lead churches in the early church. He gave him a voice, and Paul worked with him, and he trusted him because of his faith to lead these churches. He was sent to places like Corinth and Thessalonica by Paul to preach, and he is called child, son, brother, and co-worker, all by Paul. Paul knew that the greater church needed Timothy. Now, I have a mentor today. I've known her for a little more than 10 years, and she knows me. She's more like a friend today now, honestly, but she's somebody a little bit older than me who I can bounce ideas off of, I can be corrected by, I can learn from her. And I've also had the privilege of mentoring a lot of young college women through Young Life. I used to be on staff with them, with Young Life in this area, and through them mentored a lot of college girls, led a lot of Bible studies. That's, as Sydney said, that's where we met. And here's the thing, though. I know for a lot of those girls meeting with me, they probably felt like they were learning from me, but the reality is I really learned a lot from them over coffee. And they helped me see Scripture in a different way than I never had before. They helped me ask better questions of the text, and they helped me wrestle through how to take these big theological thoughts and how to live them out with your peers, whether for me that might be my husband and my kids, or for them was a roommate in a dorm, and how to live through that. How do you take this theology and these beliefs that you've had, and how does that play out in your day-to-day life? And they sharpened me, and they're a big reason why I'm in seminary today. I wish that I would have had a mentor when I was your age and when I was younger. I believe that I did have a sincere faith like Timothy, but ironically, I wasn't really allowed to use it in the church. And when Sydney asked some of us to fill in for this section on letters to my younger self, one of the things she said was, what would have been impactful to hear as a college student? And though I couldn't see it then, what I would say to you now is, we need your voice. We need your voice in the church. Maybe you are multi-ethnic like Timothy. We need your voice. We need a perspective that you have that we don't. And I need your point of view. Maybe you're fatherless like Timothy and like I was. We need your voice too. You have an empathy towards those who are grieving and suffering that the church needs to hear from. And all of you in this room are younger like Timothy. We need your voice here, and I need your voice here. I see your generation out there changing the world, and you are out there actually doing it. So do it here in the church. We want to hear how we need to change, and you are the future of this church. So these next questions in your group, your leaders at the tables, they're going to take some notes on your questions. But what I want to ask is, what does the church need to hear from you? What would you say to the elders or the pastors if you were sitting down with them over coffee? And what do you wish the church cared more about today? So your leaders are going to write these down, and we're actually going to compile these and give them to the pastors and to the elders. And I will put a disclaimer and say I am not on staff, so I have absolutely no power to promise any change. But I can tell you that I do think they want to hear from you. And I want to use this as an opportunity to empower your voice in this church. And so we're going to compile them and give them to them and see what happens. So back to the questions, what do you think the church needs to hear from you? And what would you say to the elders or pastors if you had their ear? What do you wish the church cared more about today?